Cold Betrayal on White Slopes. Chapter 1. Dark Shadows Against Pristine Powder. Robert Bob Fletcher had weathered his share of storms, but nothing quite prepared him for the tempest brewing in his own backyard. At 41, the former Army Ranger carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd seen combat in 3 different countries and lived to tell about it. The Purple Heart tucked away in his desk drawer testified to sacrifices made in distant mountains, but the real battle for his soul was unfolding right here in the Colorado Rockies, where he'd sunk every penny of his military compensation into building something lasting. Whispering Pines Ski Resort represented more than just a business venture. It embodied his vision of American prosperity, the kind his grandfather used to describe over Sunday dinners when Bob was just a scrawny kid with big dreams. Those weathered hands that had worked steel mills in Pennsylvania would have appreciated the honest sweat that went into carving ski runs from virgin wilderness, the satisfaction of creating jobs for local families, the pride of seeing the stars and stripes flutter above something you'd built with your own determination. His wife Sarah, 35 and still carrying herself with the grace of the small-town beauty queen she'd once been, managed their financial operations with an efficiency that would have impressed his old drill sergeant. Bob had discovered her 7 years ago during a blizzard that nearly claimed her life, a lost soul wandering in whiteout conditions who'd literally stumbled into his arms and, eventually, his heart. Their love story had become local legend, the wounded warrior and the damsel in distress, finding salvation in each other's embrace. But legends, as Bob was learning, sometimes contained more fiction than fact. The morning briefing at Whispering Pines commenced with the familiar ritual of strong coffee and stronger resolve. Bob positioned himself behind the conference table, unconsciously favoring his left leg, where Iraqi shrapnel had left its permanent calling card. The pain flared during these high-altitude winters, a meteorological reminder of battles fought and brothers lost. Yet he never allowed physical discomfort to diminish his authority, a lesson drilled into him during 12 years of military service. Something felt different today, though. Perhaps it was the way Sarah's attention seemed magnetized toward their newest staff addition, or maybe it was the subtle shift in office dynamics that his combat-honed instincts detected like a change in barometric pressure. "Gentlemen and ladies," Bob's voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being heard over helicopter rotors and artillery fire. "Next week marks the culmination of 3 years' worth of planning and prayer. We're launching the Summit Express chairlift system, our ticket to competing with Vail and Aspen in the big leagues." He surveyed the assembled faces, nodding the mix of excitement and apprehension that accompanied any major undertaking. Ski resort operations attracted a particular breed of individual, part athlete, part entrepreneur, part dreamer willing to bet their future on the capricious nature of winter weather and tourist spending patterns. "Safety protocols must be absolutely flawless," Bob continued, his gaze settling on the figure leaning casually against the back wall. "Which brings me to our latest addition to the team. I'd like you all to meet Marcus Kane, our new head of risk assessment and extreme sports instruction." Marcus stepped forward with the fluid confidence of a natural performer. Standing just over 6 feet with the kind of rugged good looks that belonged in cigarette advertisements, he possessed an almost magnetic quality that seemed to draw people into his orbit. His smile, practiced yet seemingly genuine, had already worked its magic on most of the female staff members. Bob noticed how Sarah unconsciously straightened her posture when Marcus entered her field of vision. "Appreciate the warm welcome, folks." Marcus's voice carried just the right blend of professional competence and approachable charm. "I've spent the last month conducting a comprehensive evaluation of your current safety infrastructure, and I've identified several areas where we can significantly enhance both security and operational efficiency." The man spoke with the polished delivery of someone who'd pitched these same concepts before, his hands moving expressively as he outlined his vision for systematic improvements. Bob found himself grudgingly impressed by Marcus's apparent expertise, even as something deeper, perhaps the warrior's intuition that had kept him alive in hostile territory, whispered warnings he couldn't quite articulate. Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm Bob remembered from their early days together. The insurance company representatives were absolutely fascinated by Marcus's proposals when we spoke with them last week. His background includes oversight of resort operations from Vermont to California. We're incredibly fortunate to have attracted someone of his caliber to our little operation here in the mountains. Bob noticed how his wife's fingers absently twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit that had emerged only recently, coinciding with Marcus's arrival at Whispering Pines. The gesture triggered a memory of their wedding day, when those same hands had trembled as she'd spoken her vows, when her voice had caught on the words, "Till death do us part." He'd attributed the emotion to overwhelming joy. Now he wondered if perhaps she'd been prescient about forces that would test their bond. "Outstanding work," Bob managed, forcing warmth into his acknowledgement. "Marcus, I'd appreciate you walking me through the technical details after we wrap up here. Sarah, remind me about our timeline for final inspections." "Everything needs to be completed by Friday," she replied, consulting her leather-bound planner with characteristic precision. "The grand opening ceremony is scheduled for Saturday morning, with media coverage and potential investors arriving from Denver and Colorado Springs. The weather forecast looks perfect: fresh powder overnight, clear skies through the weekend." As the meeting dispersed, Bob lingered behind, ostensibly reviewing paperwork while actually observing the subtle interactions between his wife and their new hire. The way Marcus's hand brushed Sarah's shoulder as he reached for documents, the manner in which she tilted her head when listening to his explanations, a gesture Bob remembered from their own courtship. The shared laughter over some private joke that excluded everyone else in the room. Combat had taught him to recognize danger in its myriad forms, but this particular threat felt more treacherous than anything he'd faced in uniform. Enemy snipers and improvised explosive devices were straightforward adversaries compared to the complex emotions and betrayals that could undermine a man's foundation from within his own home. After everyone departed, Bob made his way through the resort's grounds, following the patrol route he'd established during their first year of operation. Fresh snow crunched beneath his boots as he ascended toward Eagle's Roost, a secluded cabin positioned on the resort's most challenging run, currently closed for the winter season. This particular location held special significance. The exact spot where he discovered Sarah 7 years ago, hypothermic and disoriented, her car abandoned miles away after she'd attempted to navigate mountain roads during a blizzard. The memory remained vivid, her blue lips forming soundless words as he'd wrapped her in his jacket, the weight of her unconscious body as he'd carried her to safety, the overwhelming gratitude in her eyes when she'd awakened in the lodge's medical facility. That rescue had transformed them both, binding their lives together in ways that seemed unbreakable. Until now. Bob stopped abruptly, his attention captured by an anomaly in the pristine snowscape. Footprints, 2 distinct sets, led toward Eagle's Roost service entrance. The tracks appeared fresh, created within the last few hours despite the cabin's official closure status. His pulse quickened as recognition dawned. One set belonged to standard women's boots, approximately size 7, the other to men's hiking footwear, size 11 or 12. Moving with the stealth that had once made him invaluable during reconnaissance missions, Bob approached the cabin's rear window. Voices drifted through the inadequately sealed glass, familiar tones speaking words that pierced his heart like fragments from an enemy grenade. "Relax, sweetheart." Sarah's voice carried a playful quality he hadn't heard in months. Bob's completely oblivious to what's happening under his nose. The poor man so consumed with his precious resort project that he couldn't spot obvious clues if they were painted in neon colors across the mountainside. This expansion has become his obsession. He trusts me implicitly with every financial decision. What about the insurance documentation? Marcus's deeper voice responded, its tone more calculating than the charming persona he displayed publicly. We'll need his signature on several additional policies before Saturday's opening. Leave that to me, darling. I've been handling our business paperwork for years. Bob signs whatever I place in front of him without reading the fine print. He considers financial management beneath his attention, something better suited to his capable little wife. The sound of intimate laughter followed, accompanied by movements that Bob's imagination filled with unwelcome detail. His hands clenched involuntarily, muscle memory reaching for weapons that weren't there. But 12 years of military training had ingrained deeper lessons than mere combat techniques: the paramount importance of reconnaissance before action, the necessity of understanding your enemy's complete strategy before launching any counteroffensive. Bob retreated silently from the cabin, his mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had served him well during covert operations. Emotion could be compartmentalized, filed away until mission completion allowed for its proper processing. Right now, he needed intelligence, evidence, and a comprehensive understanding of exactly what kind of operation was being mounted against him. Evening found Sarah unusually animated as she prepared an elaborate dinner in their kitchen. Candlelight flickered across her features, highlighting the high cheekbones and expressive eyes that had first captured his attention. She'd selected his favorite wine, a California Cabernet they discovered during their honeymoon, and wore the emerald dress that transformed her from beautiful to absolutely stunning. Marcus submitted some fascinating proposals today, she chattered while arranging place settings with unnecessary precision. His experience with complex insurance negotiations could save us substantial money while dramatically increasing our coverage limits. Apparently, he maintains excellent relationships with several major carriers who specialize in high-risk recreational facilities. Bob sipped his wine slowly, studying his wife's animated expression over the rim of his glass. Marcus certainly seems knowledgeable about the industry. Tell me more about these insurance modifications. Nothing too technical, really. Sarah's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly. Just standard liability adjustments and some enhanced coverage for equipment failures or weather-related incidents. You know how these insurance people love their complicated paperwork and redundant policies. Of course, Bob nodded thoughtfully. I trust your judgment completely, sweetheart. Handle whatever arrangements you think best. Sarah's smile brightened, but Bob caught a glimpse of something else flickering behind her eyes: relief, perhaps, or maybe anticipation. The expression vanished so quickly he might have imagined it, except his training had taught him to notice micro-expressions that revealed concealed thoughts. Later that night, after Sarah had fallen asleep beside him, Bob sat in his study reviewing Marcus Kane's employment file. Something about the man's credentials nagged at his consciousness, minor inconsistencies that civilian eyes might overlook, but stood out prominently to someone versed in document analysis and personnel verification. He reached for his secure phone and dialed a number memorized years ago, but rarely used since leaving active duty. Tommy Sullivan, this is Bob Fletcher. Sorry for the late hour, but I need a favor. Remember that conversation we had about staying in touch if either of us ever needed assistance? Well, I'm cashing in that chip tonight. Tommy had served as an intelligence liaison during Bob's final deployment, a relationship forged in the crucible of shared dangers and mutual respect. If anyone could conduct a thorough background investigation without leaving digital footprints, it would be Tommy. I need everything you can find on a Marcus Kane, approximately 30 years old, claims extensive experience in ski resort operations and safety consulting. I'm particularly interested in his employment history and any connections to unusual incidents at previous locations. Bob provided additional details while gazing through his window at the snow-covered slopes where his dreams had taken physical form. Somewhere out there, forces were aligning against everything he'd built, everything he'd believed in. But if combat had taught him anything, it was that preparation and patience often proved more valuable than raw courage. The call that would change everything was still hours away, but Bob sensed its approach like an experienced mountaineer detecting the subtle signs of an approaching avalanche. Chapter 2: Shadows from the Past. The telephone's shrill cry shattered Bob's restless sleep at 2:47 a.m., according to the glowing digits on his nightstand clock. Years of military conditioning had trained him to achieve full alertness within seconds, but Sarah barely stirred beside him, her breathing maintaining the steady rhythm of undisturbed slumber. Bob slipped from their bed with practiced silence, padding barefoot to his study where caller ID revealed Tommy Sullivan's name. "Bob, I hope you're sitting down for this conversation." Tommy's voice carried the grim undertones Bob recognized from their deployments together, the particular gravity reserved for intelligence that could get people killed. "What I've uncovered about your Marcus Kane makes our worst experiences in Fallujah look like a church picnic." Bob settled into his leather chair, automatically reaching for the bottle of bourbon he kept for occasions when sleep seemed unlikely to return. His hand paused halfway to the glass as Tommy's words registered fully. Over the past 6 years, 5 different ski resorts have declared bankruptcy following catastrophic accidents that resulted in multiple fatalities. Insurance companies paid out settlements totaling nearly $200 million. Each incident appeared to be a tragic coincidence: equipment failures, freak weather conditions, operator error. But here's where it gets interesting. Every single resort employed a safety consultant in the months preceding their disasters. Bob felt ice forming in his stomach as the implications crystallized. Same person. Different names, different backgrounds, but identical methodology. Your Marcus Kane has operated under at least 4 separate identities that I've been able to confirm. The man's a professional, Bob, former military contractor with a specialty in what the private sector euphemistically calls infrastructure consulting. Tommy's pause carried weight, the kind of silence that preceded revelations nobody wanted to hear. He served with Blackwater Solutions before they rebranded themselves. Officially, he was a logistics specialist. Unofficially, he handled situations that required permanent solutions to temporary problems. The kind of work that comes with 7-figure paydays and zero accountability. Bob's combat-trained mind immediately began calculating angles and probabilities. Sarah mentioned insurance adjustments, expanded coverage. That's their signature move. Inflate the policies to maximum levels, then engineer accidents that appear completely accidental. The surviving ownership, usually a spouse or business partner, collects enough money to retire comfortably while the consultant disappears into his next identity. How do they select their targets? Financially stressed operations with substantial insurance potential and vulnerable owners. Places where a tragedy wouldn't surprise anyone, given the inherent risks of mountain recreation. They're parasites, Bob, but incredibly sophisticated ones. Tommy's voice dropped further. There's something else you need to know. In every case, there was a woman involved, someone with access to financial records and decision-making authority, someone the owner trusted completely. Bob closed his eyes, remembering Sarah's animated discussion of insurance modifications, her enthusiasm for Marcus's professional expertise, the way her wedding ring had twisted nervously around her finger. What happened to these women afterward? That's where the story gets really ugly. 3 of them died in accidents within 6 months of collecting their insurance settlements. Apparently, Marcus doesn't believe in sharing long-term profits with temporary partners. The bourbon glass trembled slightly in Bob's grip as rage and betrayal warred with tactical thinking. His wife wasn't just committing adultery. She was collaborating in a scheme that had already claimed multiple lives and would almost certainly claim hers as well. Tommy, I need complete files on every incident. Documentation, witness statements, autopsy reports, everything you can access without triggering official attention. Already compiled and encrypted. You'll have it within the hour. But Bob, Tommy's voice carried genuine concern. These people are professionals. They've successfully executed this operation multiple times without leaving evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny. If you're planning some kind of intervention, you need to be absolutely certain about your approach. Don't worry about me, Bob replied with grim certainty. I learned a few professional skills myself during my time in uniform. Dawn arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of mountain morning that made Bob remember why he'd fallen in love with Colorado's high country. The resort buzzed with pre-opening activity as staff members prepared for the final inspection phase. Marcus moved through the facility like a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony, offering guidance here, making adjustments there, charming everyone with his seemingly inexhaustible enthusiasm. Bob observed from his office window as Marcus consulted with the lift maintenance crew, noting how the man's body language shifted when he thought himself unobserved. The affable facade occasionally slipped, revealing glimpses of someone far more calculating and dangerous than his public persona suggested. "Good morning, darling." Sarah entered his office carrying a steaming mug of coffee prepared exactly as he preferred, black with a splash of cream. Her smile seemed particularly radiant today, her movements carrying an energy that Bob now recognized as anticipation rather than simple excitement about their business prospects. "Beautiful day for skiing," Bob observed, accepting the coffee with practiced affection. "Marcus seems to have everything well in hand." "He's absolutely remarkable," Sarah's response came with undisguised admiration. "The man possesses an almost supernatural ability to identify potential problems before they become dangerous. We're incredibly fortunate to have attracted someone of his caliber to our operation." Bob sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "I've been reviewing our insurance modifications. Some of the coverage amounts seem rather ambitious for a resort our size." For just an instant, Sarah's expression flickered, a micro-expression of alarm quickly masked by renewed enthusiasm. "Marcus recommended comprehensive protection given the current litigation climate. You know how aggressive personal injury attorneys have become. Better to err on the side of caution, especially with the new chairlift system." "Absolutely," Bob agreed. "Safety first, just like in the military." Speaking of which, Marcus mentioned his background includes some government contracting work. I should have him tell me more about that experience. Always interesting to meet a fellow veteran. Sarah's fingers found her wedding ring again, twisting the gold band with nervous energy. "I'm sure he'd love to share stories. You military men always seem to find common ground in your experiences." Bob spent the morning conducting his own inspection of the chairlift system, paying particular attention to areas where Marcus had recommended modifications. His engineering background, acquired through necessity during his years overseeing military construction projects, allowed him to understand the technical specifications with greater depth than Marcus probably expected. What he discovered sent chills through his core. The adjustments were indeed professionally executed, but they followed a pattern that would create catastrophic failure under specific conditions, conditions that could easily occur during a crowded opening day celebration. Reduced cable tension at critical stress points, modified safety protocols that created windows of vulnerability, emergency systems that had been subtly compromised while maintaining the appearance of enhanced protection. Marcus Kane wasn't just planning theft. He was engineering mass murder disguised as accidental tragedy. By afternoon, Bob had assembled a comprehensive picture of the operation targeting his resort. The insurance policy Sarah had arranged would indeed provide substantial compensation, enough to make the surviving spouse wealthy beyond conventional imagination. The timing coincided perfectly with peak tourist season, ensuring maximum media coverage and minimum suspicion about regulatory oversight. "Bastard's good," Bob muttered, reviewing technical diagrams in his study. "Ruthlessly, professionally good." But professional killers made one crucial mistake. They assumed their targets would respond emotionally rather than tactically. Marcus Kane had spent months studying Bob Fletcher, the businessman, the husband, the apparent mark. He'd never bothered to research Master Sergeant Robert Fletcher, United States Army Rangers, veteran of 3 combat deployments and recipient of commendations for operations that remained classified decades later. That oversight would prove expensive. Bob's phone buzzed with a text message from Tommy. "Additional intelligence attached. Your boy's real name is Michael Castellano, wanted by Interpol for questioning regarding incidents in Switzerland and Austria. Extremely dangerous. Suggest you contact federal authorities immediately." Bob deleted the message after memorizing its contents. Federal authorities would require evidence, warrants, investigations that could take months to develop. Meanwhile, hundreds of innocent families were planning to attend Saturday's grand opening celebration, trusting that Whispering Pines Ski Resort would provide safe, memorable experiences rather than violent death. He had less than 48 hours to prevent a massacre while protecting his own life from 2 people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill for profit. Time to start evening the odds. Chapter 3: The Art of Deception. Bob Fletcher stood in his study as midnight approached, surrounded by documentation that painted a picture more chilling than anything he'd encountered during his military service. Tommy's intelligence files lay spread across his desk like pieces of a macabre puzzle: autopsy photographs, insurance claims, newspaper accounts of tragic accidents that had claimed dozens of lives across multiple states. Each incident followed an identical pattern: a recently upgraded ski facility experiencing catastrophic equipment failure during peak operation periods. The timing seemed almost supernatural in its precision, always occurring when maximum casualties and media attention would result, always leaving behind grieving widows who collected enormous insurance settlements before mysteriously dying themselves within months. Bob picked up a photograph from the Swiss incident Tommy had mentioned. 23 dead, including an entire family from Michigan celebrating their daughter's college graduation. The chairlift cable had snapped during the resort's busiest day of the season, sending cars plummeting into a ravine. The official investigation blamed metal fatigue and operator negligence, but Bob's trained eye recognized signatures of deliberate sabotage in the technical reports. "Professional bastard," he whispered, studying Marcus Kane's employment records under various aliases. The man possessed credentials that would impress any resort owner: degrees from respected universities, references from prestigious facilities, safety certifications that appeared legitimate until subjected to deeper scrutiny. But beneath the polished resume lurked something far more sinister. Bob had known men like Marcus during his military career: mercenaries who traded honor for profit, soldiers who discovered that violence could be monetized if applied with sufficient sophistication. Such individuals understood that the difference between heroism and terrorism often depended entirely on perspective and compensation. A soft sound from the hallway caused Bob to quickly gather the files into his wall safe. Sarah appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim lighting from their bedroom. She wore the silk negligee he'd given her for their anniversary, her hair cascading loosely around her shoulders in a style that once would have driven him to distraction. "Working late again." Her voice carried gentle reproach mixed with something else, perhaps concern that he might be discovering information she preferred to keep hidden. "You've been so tense lately, darling. Is everything all right with the opening preparations?" Bob forced warmth into his smile, drawing upon acting skills he'd never realized he possessed. Just reviewing final details, sweetheart. You know how I obsess over every little element when something important is at stake. Sarah moved closer, her fingers tracing patterns along his shoulder blades with practiced intimacy. The resort will be magnificent, Bob. Marcus has assured me that every safety protocol exceeds industry standards. We're going to host the most successful opening in Colorado history. I'm sure we will, Bob agreed, allowing her to massage tension from his muscles while his mind calculated angles and probabilities. Marcus certainly seems confident about his preparations. He's remarkable. Sarah's voice carried the dreamy quality Bob now recognized as infatuation rather than simple professional admiration. Sometimes I think we don't deserve someone of his caliber. But then again, maybe the universe has finally decided to reward us for all the hardships we've endured. Bob turned in his chair to face his wife, studying features that had once represented everything good and pure in his world. 7 years of marriage had given him intimate knowledge of her expressions, her gestures, her subtle tells when emotion overwhelmed careful control. Tonight, he saw anticipation mixed with guilt, the complex emotions of someone simultaneously betraying and justifying her actions. "Come to bed," Sarah whispered, taking his hand with fingers that trembled slightly. "Tomorrow will be hectic enough without you exhausting yourself tonight." Bob allowed himself to be led toward their bedroom, playing the role of the devoted husband who trusted his wife completely. But as Sarah settled beside him in the darkness, he remained awake for hours, listening to her breathing while formulating plans that would require every skill he'd acquired during 12 years of military service. By morning, he'd reached several conclusions that would have chilled Sarah to her core, had she possessed any inkling of his tactical capabilities. The pre-opening inspection began with Marcus conducting a comprehensive tour for resort staff, media representatives, and potential investors. Bob watched from the lodge's main deck as the man performed his role with Oscar-worthy conviction, pointing out safety features, explaining emergency protocols, radiating the kind of professional confidence that made everyone feel secure about entrusting their lives to his expertise. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus addressed the assembled group with the polished delivery of a natural showman. "What you're witnessing represents the absolute pinnacle of modern chairlift technology. Every component has been tested beyond manufacturer specifications. Every safety system has been redundantly backed up. Every possible failure mode has been anticipated and prevented." Bob noted how Marcus's gaze occasionally found Sarah in the crowd, how their eyes met with the kind of intimate communication that excluded everyone else present. The bastard was actually enjoying himself, savoring the elaborate deception while anticipating the rewards that would follow Saturday's opening ceremony. The insurance company executives were particularly impressed during their inspection yesterday, Sarah added, addressing questions from a Denver business journalist. "Our coverage levels exceed industry standards precisely because we've invested in such comprehensive safety measures." Bob felt bile rising in his throat as he listened to his wife, enthusiastically promoting the very policies that would profit from mass murder. But he maintained his facade of ignorant contentment, nodding approval at appropriate moments while his mind cataloged every detail that would prove useful during the confrontation he was planning. After the group departed for lunch, Bob made his way to the chairlift's upper terminal, ostensibly for a final personal inspection, but actually to implement modifications of his own. His engineering background and combat experience provided knowledge that Marcus Kane couldn't possibly anticipate, understanding of structural stress points, familiarity with explosive devices, and most importantly, expertise in creating controlled failures that would occur exactly when and where he determined. Working with tools borrowed from the maintenance shed, Bob carefully adjusted several components that Marcus had modified for sabotage. But instead of creating random catastrophic failure, Bob's alterations would ensure that any equipment problems would manifest in a specific, predictable manner, one that would demonstrate deliberate sabotage while protecting innocent lives. Insurance fraud and attempted mass murder, Bob muttered as he worked. Even military tribunals would approve of what I'm planning for you, Marcus. That evening, Bob suggested a private dinner for just the three of them, himself, Sarah, and Marcus, as a way of expressing gratitude for the exceptional work their safety consultant had performed. The invitation seemed to delight both of his intended victims, who probably viewed it as an opportunity to enjoy their deception while celebrating their anticipated profits. The Whispering Pines Lodge's private dining room provided an intimate setting that allowed Bob to observe his guests' interactions with documentary precision. Sarah had chosen a wine-colored dress that emphasized her figure, while Marcus wore a casually elegant ensemble that probably cost more than most resort employees earned in a month. They sat slightly closer together than mere business associates would, their conversation peppered with private jokes and meaningful glances. "A toast," Bob proposed, raising his glass of single malt scotch, "to partnerships that exceed our wildest expectations." "To new beginnings," Sarah responded, her cheeks glowing from wine and anticipation. "To successful ventures," Marcus added with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Bob sipped his drink while studying the man who planned to murder hundreds of innocent people. Marcus possessed the kind of superficial charm that would appeal to women like Sarah, sophisticated enough to seem cultured, dangerous enough to provide excitement, wealthy enough to promise financial security. But beneath the polished exterior lurked something fundamentally predatory, a coldness that Bob recognized from his encounters with professional killers in various theaters of operation. "Marcus, I've been curious about your military background," Bob began conversationally. "Sarah mentioned you served as a contractor in some interesting locations." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Bob caught the almost imperceptible pause that preceded his response. "Logistics work, mostly. Infrastructure assessment and security consulting in various challenging environments. Nothing particularly glamorous." "Still, it must have provided valuable experience for your current career," Bob pressed gently. "Understanding how systems can fail under stress, recognizing potential vulnerabilities before they become problems." "Exactly," Marcus agreed, his smile becoming slightly more forced. "Civilian applications often benefit from military-grade analysis." Bob nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine insurance companies appreciate that kind of thorough evaluation, especially for high-risk operations like ski resorts, where equipment failure could result in significant casualties." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds too long. Sarah's fingers found her wedding ring again, while Marcus reached for his wine with movements just slightly more deliberate than natural conversation required. "Well," Sarah interjected with brittle cheerfulness, "let's not dwell on morbid possibilities when we're celebrating such positive developments. Tomorrow's opening will be absolutely perfect. I just know it." "Absolutely perfect," Bob agreed, his smile carrying meanings that neither of his dinner companions could possibly understand. "I'm planning some surprises that will make this an opening ceremony nobody will ever forget." Later that night, as Sarah slept peacefully beside him, Bob finalized the tactical plan that would expose Marcus Kane's operation while protecting innocent lives. Everything depended on timing, misdirection, and the kind of cold-blooded professionalism that had once made him valuable to his country's intelligence services. By dawn, Marcus Kane and Sarah Fletcher would discover that Master Sergeant Robert Fletcher had learned lessons in Afghanistan that extended far beyond conventional combat techniques. Some enemies required unconventional solutions. Chapter 4: Into the Trap. Saturday morning arrived with the crystalline perfection that only Colorado's high country could provide. Brilliant sunshine painting snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose, while a gentle breeze carried the crisp promise of ideal skiing conditions. Bob Fletcher stood at his office window, watching the first wave of visitors streaming through Whispering Pines entrance gates, their excited voices echoing across the pristine landscape like a symphony of anticipated joy. 347 people, according to the final headcount. Families from Denver and Colorado Springs, college students celebrating winter break, experienced skiers eager to test the new chairlift system that promised access to previously unreachable terrain. Among them were children who'd been anticipating this day for weeks, grandparents sharing their love of winter sports with younger generations, couples marking anniversaries and other milestones with mountain adventures. All of them trusting that Robert Fletcher's resort would provide safe, memorable experiences, rather than violent death orchestrated by the man currently charming reporters near the base lodge. Bob checked his watch. 9:15 a.m. The opening ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock, with the first chairlift runs beginning immediately afterward. Marcus Kane stood at the center of media attention, fielding questions about safety protocols with the practiced ease of someone who'd perfected this performance across multiple venues. His confidence seemed absolute, his enthusiasm infectious, the consummate professional explaining why families could trust their lives to his expertise. Sarah moved through the crowd like a gracious hostess, her smile radiant as she accepted congratulations from local dignitaries and business associates. She wore a powder blue ski outfit that complemented her coloring perfectly, her blonde hair catching sunlight in ways that made photographers gravitate toward her automatically. To casual observers, she appeared to be the proud wife of a successful entrepreneur, glowing with justified pride in their mutual accomplishment. Only Bob recognized the subtle signs of anticipation that had nothing to do with business success. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced through the public address system, "we're ready to begin our official dedication ceremony. Please join us at the base of the Summit Express chairlift for remarks from resort owner Robert Fletcher and his team." Bob made his way through the crowd, accepting handshakes and responding to congratulations with appropriate enthusiasm, while his trained eye cataloged security positions and escape routes. 3 members of the Grand County Sheriff's Department were present for crowd control, their uniforms providing reassuring authority that would prove crucial during the confrontation Bob was planning. "Friends and neighbors," Bob began his prepared remarks, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the projection skills learned during military briefings. "7 years ago, I returned home from overseas service with a dream of creating something permanent and positive in these magnificent mountains. Today, that dream becomes reality through the dedication and expertise of people who believe in the American values of hard work, integrity, and mutual support." Applause rippled through the gathering as Bob acknowledged various contributors to the resort's development. He made particular note of Sarah's financial management skills and Marcus's safety oversight, building the narrative that would soon become evidence in multiple criminal investigations. "But before we officially open the Summit Express," Bob continued, his tone shifting slightly, "I'd like to invite our safety director, Marcus Kane, to conduct one final inspection of the upper terminal. After all, nothing matters more than ensuring every component meets our stringent standards." Bob's suggestion seemed routine to most observers, but he noticed how Marcus's expression flickered with something that might have been concern. Sarah stepped closer to her husband, her hand touching his arm with gentle pressure. "Darling, is that really necessary?" she asked quietly. "We've already conducted multiple inspections, and Marcus confirmed everything meets specifications yesterday." "Just being thorough, sweetheart," Bob replied with the indulgent tone of a man humoring his wife's nervousness. "You know how I obsess over details when something important is at stake. Marcus, you don't mind taking one more look, do you?" Marcus had no choice but to agree graciously, though Bob caught the subtle exchange of glances between him and Sarah. "Of course, Bob. Professional paranoia is what keeps people safe in this business. Excellent, Bob clapped him on the shoulder with apparent camaraderie. Sarah, why don't you join us? Your financial perspective on the insurance implications might be valuable if we discover any last-minute issues. The chairlift ride to the upper terminal provided 20 minutes of enforced proximity that allowed Bob to observe his companion's interactions with microscopic precision. Marcus maintained his professional facade, pointing out various features of the lift system while subtly probing for any indication that Bob suspected anything unusual. Sarah sat between the two men, her nervous energy manifesting in continuous small movements and careful attention to every word exchanged. Beautiful view, Bob commented as they approached the upper station, gesturing toward the spectacular panorama of snow-covered peaks extending to the horizon. Sometimes, I can hardly believe we've managed to build something this magnificent in such challenging terrain. The engineering requirements were certainly complex, Marcus agreed. Balancing safety considerations with operational efficiency in this environment requires very specific expertise. Speaking of expertise, Bob said conversationally, I've been meaning to ask about your previous work with Blackwater Solutions. Must have been fascinating, helping develop security protocols for international operations. Marcus went very still. Sarah's hand found her wedding ring again, twisting the gold band with movements that had become almost constant. The chairlift's mechanical humming seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. I'm not sure what you mean, Marcus replied carefully. My background is primarily in civilian consulting. Oh, my mistake, Bob's smile never wavered. I must have confused you with someone else, although the name Michael Castellano did sound familiar when my friend Tommy mentioned it. The color drained from Marcus's face as realization dawned. Sarah grabbed Bob's arm with desperate pressure, her fingernails digging into his jacket. Bob, what are you talking about? She demanded, panic creeping into her voice. Who's Michael Castellano? Why don't you ask your boyfriend? Bob suggested pleasantly. I'm sure he has fascinating stories about ski resort accidents in Switzerland and Austria. Don't you, Marcus? Or should I call you Michael? Marcus's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket, but Bob was faster. Years of combat training manifested in movements too quick for civilian eyes to follow, his own weapon appearing with practiced efficiency. I wouldn't recommend that course of action, Bob said calmly. We're 600 feet above ground in a moving chairlift car. Even if you managed to shoot me, you'd still have to explain to the authorities why you're carrying false identification and illegal weapons. You son of a bitch, Marcus snarled, his carefully constructed persona finally cracking to reveal the killer beneath. You have no idea what you're interfering with. Actually, I know exactly what I'm interfering with, Bob replied. Mass murder disguised as accidental equipment failure, insurance fraud involving millions of dollars, and the planned elimination of my wife once she's served her purpose. Sarah stared between the two men, confusion and terror warring in her expression. Bob, I don't understand what's happening. Marcus, tell him this is some kind of mistake. There's no mistake, sweetheart. Bob's voice carried gentle sadness that was perhaps the first genuine emotion he displayed all morning. Marcus Kane doesn't exist. The man you've been sleeping with is actually Michael Castellano, a professional killer who's engineered at least 5 similar operations across multiple states, and you've been helping him plan the murder of everyone at today's opening ceremony. The chairlift reached the upper terminal with a mechanical clunk that seemed to echo across the mountain peaks. Bob gestured for his companions to exit first, maintaining tactical advantage while herding them toward the isolated platform where the final confrontation would unfold. Here's what's going to happen, Bob announced once they stood on the wooden deck overlooking the vast wilderness below. Marcus, you're going to demonstrate exactly how you sabotaged this chairlift system. Sarah, you're going to explain to the sheriff's deputies who are waiting at the base station why you modified our insurance policies to benefit from mass casualties. And then you're both going to spend the rest of your lives in federal prison, contemplating the families you plan to destroy for profit." Marcus laughed harshly. "You think you've won something, Fletcher. You have no evidence, no witnesses, nothing that would stand up in court." Bob reached into his jacket and produced a small recording device. 3 hours of conversation from your private meetings at Eagle's Roost Cabin. Every detail of your operation, including Sarah's enthusiastic participation, plus complete documentation of your real identity and previous crimes, courtesy of military intelligence sources you never suspected existed. "You bastard," Sarah whispered, her face contorting with rage and betrayal. "You manipulated us. You made us think we were fooling you." "I learned something during my military service, darling," Bob replied with cold satisfaction. "The most effective way to defeat an enemy is to let them defeat themselves. You've been providing evidence of your own crimes for weeks, recording every conversation, documenting every illegal modification, creating an irrefutable case against yourselves." Marcus suddenly lunged toward the chairlift controls, apparently attempting to trigger the catastrophic failure he'd planned for the opening ceremony. But Bob had anticipated this possibility, had spent hours during the previous night ensuring that any such attempt would fail spectacularly. The sound of Marcus's hand striking the emergency shutdown button echoed across the mountain like a gunshot. But instead of initiating equipment failure, the action triggered a comprehensive safety lockdown that Bob had programmed using his knowledge of the system's computerized controls. "Surprise," Bob said quietly as sirens began wailing from the base station below. "I've been modifying your modifications for the past week. Every sabotaged component, every weakened connection, every device you installed to cause maximum casualties. I've neutralized all of it while creating evidence that will prove deliberate criminal intent." Sheriff's Department helicopters appeared over the ridge, their rotors beating steady rhythms as they approached the upper terminal. Bob had coordinated this operation with military precision, ensuring that Marcus Kane and Sarah Fletcher would have no opportunity for escape or violence against innocent bystanders. "Robert Fletcher, you magnificent bastard," Marcus said with grudging admiration as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "I underestimated you completely." "Most people do," Bob replied. "That's usually their last mistake." As Sarah was led away in restraints, tears streaming down her face, she turned back toward her husband with desperate pleading in her eyes. "Bob, please, I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I wanted something better than this." "I know, sweetheart." Bob's voice carried genuine sorrow for the woman he'd loved completely and trusted without reservation. "But the people you plan to murder today also wanted something better. The difference is, they weren't willing to kill for it." The chairlift system remained closed for the rest of the day, while federal investigators documented evidence of the planned attack. But by evening, Bob Fletcher stood alone on his deck, watching families depart safely to their homes, knowing that his actions had prevented a tragedy that would have devastated countless lives. 347 people had trusted him to provide safe mountain experiences. Despite everything he discovered about his wife's betrayal and the conspiracy against his resort, he'd honored that trust in the only way that mattered. Some victories came at prices too high to celebrate, but they remained victories nonetheless. Chapter 5: The Cold Truth Unveiled. The federal courthouse in Denver hummed with quiet efficiency as the investigation into what prosecutors had dubbed Operation Snowfall entered its third week. Special Agent Patricia Valdez of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had seen her share of complex fraud cases, but the scope and sophistication of the conspiracy to commit mass murder for insurance profits ranked among the most chilling in her 15-year career. "Mr. Fletcher," Agent Valdez addressed Bob from across the conference table, her voice carrying professional respect tinged with genuine admiration. "Your evidence collection over the past month has been absolutely extraordinary. I've worked with trained investigators who couldn't have assembled documentation this comprehensive." Bob remained seated with the ramrod-straight posture that 12 years of military service had ingrained into his very bones. Despite the emotional devastation of discovering his wife's betrayal, he'd approached the investigation with the methodical precision that had once made him valuable to Army intelligence operations. "Agent Valdez, when you've seen what I've seen during combat deployments, you learn that half measures get people killed. Marcus Kane, or Michael Castellano, or whatever he's calling himself this week, was planning to murder hundreds of innocent families. That kind of threat requires total commitment to stopping it." Spread across the conference table lay the fruits of Bob's covert investigation. Audio recordings from concealed devices he'd planted throughout Whispering Pines, financial documents proving illegal insurance modifications, technical specifications demonstrating deliberate sabotage of chairlift safety systems, and perhaps most damning, correspondence between Sarah and her mother discussing their plans to profit from mass casualties. "The pattern is absolutely consistent with 5 previous incidents we've now linked to Castellano," Agent Valdez continued, consulting thick files that contained autopsy photographs and crime scene documentation from multiple states. Vermont, New Hampshire, Utah, California, and the international incidents in Switzerland and Austria. Same methodology, same timing, same devastating results. Bob studied the photographs of previous victims, smiling families who trusted their lives to ski resorts where Michael Castellano had engineered catastrophic equipment failures. Children who'd been anticipating mountain adventures, parents who'd saved for special vacation experiences, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries in alpine settings that became their final resting places. "How many total casualties?" Bob asked quietly. 87 confirmed deaths across all incidents, with hundreds of additional injuries ranging from minor to permanently disabling. The insurance payouts totaled nearly $300 million, with surviving spouses collecting the majority before mysteriously dying themselves within 6 to 12 months. Agent Valdez opened another file containing surveillance photographs of Michael Castellano, taken at various resort locations over the past 6 years. The man possessed an almost chameleon-like ability to alter his appearance and persona, sometimes appearing as a rugged outdoorsman, other times as a polished executive, occasionally as a laid-back instructor whose primary concern seemed to be helping tourists enjoy mountain experiences. "He's a professional predator," Bob observed, recognizing tactical signatures he'd encountered during military operations against international criminal organizations. Military training, intelligence background, completely compartmentalized emotional responses. The kind of individual who can engineer mass murder while maintaining genuine-seeming relationships with his victims. "Which brings us to your wife's involvement." Agent Valdez's tone became more cautious, acknowledging the personal pain these revelations had inflicted. "Based on our analysis of the evidence you provided, Sarah Fletcher appears to have been both victim and willing participant in Castellano's operation." Bob had spent sleepless nights grappling with this exact complexity. The woman he'd married, the person he'd trusted with his heart and his business, had somehow evolved into someone capable of collaborating in mass murder while sharing their marriage bed and planning their future together. "She wanted money," Bob said simply. "Not just moderate wealth or comfortable retirement, but the kind of generational fortune that would elevate her into a completely different social stratum. Castellano offered her the opportunity to acquire $50 million in a single day, and she was willing to overlook the mass casualties that would make such profits possible." Agent Valdez consulted her notes. The intercepted communications between Sarah and her mother suggest this wasn't entirely Castellano's idea. Mrs. Fletcher apparently initiated contact with criminal organizations after becoming frustrated with your resort's slower than expected profitability. This revelation had particularly stung Bob, representing a level of betrayal that extended beyond simple adultery into something approaching treason against their shared dreams and values. Sarah hadn't been seduced into criminal activity. She'd actively sought it out as a solution to her impatience with conventional business success. The financial analysis is fascinating, Agent Valdez continued, spreading charts and bank statements across the table. Mrs. Fletcher had been systematically diverting resort profits into offshore accounts for over 18 months, apparently preparing for her eventual disappearance after collecting insurance money. She also established false identities and travel documentation that would have allowed her to vanish completely once Castellano had served his purpose. Bob felt cold satisfaction at this confirmation of his tactical assessment. Sarah hadn't been Castellano's helpless victim or naive accomplice. She'd been planning to betray him just as thoroughly as she'd betrayed her husband. The collision between two equally ruthless predators had created an opportunity for justice that might not have existed if either had operated alone. "What's their current status?" Bob asked. "Castellano is being held without bail on federal charges including conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and terrorism-related offenses. He's facing potential death penalty consideration, given the scope of his previous crimes. Mrs. Fletcher is also being held without bail on similar charges, though her attorneys are negotiating for cooperation in exchange for life imprisonment rather than execution." Agent Valdez closed the files with finality that suggested the investigative phase was nearing completion. "Mr. Fletcher, I want you to understand something. Your actions probably saved 300 lives that day. The technical analysis confirms that Castellano's sabotage would have resulted in catastrophic chairlift failure during peak operating hours. The casualty count would have exceeded any previous ski resort accident in American history." Bob nodded acknowledgement, though the satisfaction of preventing mass murder was tempered by the personal cost of discovering his wife's true nature. Everything he'd built, every dream they'd shared, every moment of intimacy they'd experienced had been contaminated by her willingness to profit from others' deaths. "There's one more thing," Agent Valdez added, her tone becoming more personal. "The families you saved will never know your name or understand the specific threat you neutralized. But their children will grow up, their grandparents will enjoy more holidays, their marriages will continue building memories. That's the kind of victory that doesn't appear in newspapers or history books, but it matters more than any public recognition ever could." 6 months later, Bob Fletcher stood on the deck of his rebuilt lodge, watching the first snowfall of another Colorado winter dust the peaks that had become his sanctuary and his battlefield. Whispering Pines Ski Resort had reopened with enhanced safety protocols and a reputation for integrity that attracted visitors from across the nation. The attempted mass murder had, paradoxically, established the resort as a symbol of trustworthiness in an industry where safety concerns could make or break businesses overnight. Sarah's trial had concluded with a life sentence without possibility of parole, her cooperation in exposing Castellano's broader network having spared her from execution. Bob had attended every day of proceedings, not from lingering affection, but from a sense of duty to the victims whose justice his investigation had made possible. Michael Castellano had shown no remorse during his own trial, maintaining the cold professionalism that had made him successful across multiple operations. When the death sentence was pronounced, he'd simply nodded acknowledgement, as if receiving confirmation of tactical calculations he'd made years earlier. "Mr. Fletcher," the voice belonged to Jennifer Walsh, a journalist from the Denver Post who'd covered the trials extensively. "I'm writing a follow-up piece about the long-term impacts of the case. Would you be willing to share any thoughts about how this experience changed your perspective on trust and business relationships?" Bob considered the question while watching families enjoy their first ski runs of the season, their laughter echoing across slopes that had nearly become a mass grave. Ms. Walsh, I learned something important during my military service that applies equally to civilian life. Evil exists in the world, often disguised as normalcy or even charm. The only defense against it is vigilance, integrity, and the willingness to act decisively when innocent lives are at stake. Do you ever regret the personal costs of your investigation, the dissolution of your marriage, the loss of trust in someone you loved? Bob's answer came without hesitation. 347 people went home safely to their families because I chose investigation over ignorance. That's not a decision I'll ever regret, regardless of the personal consequences. As evening approached and the last skiers descended toward the lodge, Bob Fletcher remained on his deck, contemplating mountains that had witnessed both his greatest professional triumph and his most devastating personal betrayal. The peaks remained unchanged, eternal witnesses to human drama that played out in their shadows with relentless regularity. Some battles were won through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. Others required the harder victory of choosing justice over personal comfort, truth over convenient deception. In the end, the mountains kept their secrets, but they remembered who had stood firm when tested by forces that would have broken lesser men. Bob Fletcher had passed that test, even if the victory felt hollow in the cold mountain air of another solitary winter night. This story explores themes of betrayal, justice, and moral courage in the face of overwhelming personal cost. While the characters and events are fictional, they reflect the very real struggles between personal loyalty and ethical responsibility that define us as human beings.